Guivarra, welcome to Mundine's Truth Talking. Tonight we'll be discussing Indigenous business, the good, the bad and the ugly. Indigenous-owned businesses has been a core part of the government's Indigenous Advancement Strategy and also a core part of policies to increase Indigenous economic participation for the past decade. Indigenous procurement policies in government and the private sector have driven the creation of thousands of Indigenous businesses. It's time to take stock and ask what has worked, what hasn't, and where are the gaps. There is no self-determination without economic self-determination. And business is at the core of the economy, economic growth, and economic prosperity. Indigenous business creation is not a nice to have, it's essential. I want to talk tonight about the opportunities that have been created and what Indigenous people should be doing to grasp those opportunities. And I've got together a really good team for Mundine's Truth Talking, Indigenous business, the good and the bad and the ugly. So I'll introduce the good, Nancia Guivarra, former multimedia journalist and executive director of Amneris, a communications, PR, marketing and media company. And I'll leave these two blokes up to who's going to be the ugly and the bad. But James William, entrepreneur, advisor to corporates and government. Darren Godwell, CEO of Eye2Eye Global. Okay, so let's start off by talking about what is the current situation, what has been achieved, and where are we at with Indigenous business creation? I'll start off with you, Nancia.
Mm-hmm. So what have we achieved? I think that most people wouldn't realise the breadth and the depth of the number of Indigenous organisations that are operating in Australia today. There's really an organisation or a business that can fulfil pretty much any of your business needs. And for me, that's been a great realisation as I've gone into business myself this year, only in March. But I have a company that I've been running for 14 years, but not as a full-time pursuit. So, I think that I'm not sure what the numbers are, but in terms of Indigenous business, it is it's a faster growing sector than the non-Indigenous businesses sector is. And that was actually proven through, I remember in the GFC, when Indigenous businesses grew through that period when other Australian businesses went backwards. So I think that's a testimony to the strength of those Indigenous businesses and the sector that we can see those kinds of outcomes now. And I might leave it to other people to talk about some of the breadth and the depth of those businesses because they've been in it longer than me, particularly Darren.
Yeah, Darren's been around a very long time. Look, during tonight, we just relax. We sort of, people can jump in and talk at any time. And if they want to raise something that's important, they want to raise, and then go ahead and do that. Except we don't want to have a US presidential style debate where everyone's jumping in and beating each other up. We just want to start, just talk and push what you think of the opportunities. So Darren, we'll go to the elder of the night, and what do you think?
So Nancia's point about the breadth of Indigenous entrepreneurship and enterprise is also significant. We've seen again with Indigenous enterprises that when given the opportunity, they really do rise to the occasion. And we've also seen a generational shift going on where we've had individuals moving out of the public sector and into private sector. And as part of that, we're seeing that example now going back to school and school leavers, whereby we're seeing a greater number of Indigenous high school graduates moving straight into the private sector and moving into large corporations and then moving into medium-sized enterprise as well. So it really is, something to see in this generational shift. And the last 20 years in particular has given us a lot of great examples of Indigenous enterprise and entrepreneurs and business development.
Yeah, James. So how do you assess the current situation?
Well, the current situation is I'm pretty optimistic, but I think as we get into it, I think we can probably talk some of the sort of challenges that lay ahead. But I think the introduction and also the point that both Nancy and Darren made is, I think, both very, very relevant. That is, 10 years ago, if you asked, let's say you asked a corporate, a large corporation, or you asked government if they knew any Indigenous businesses, they could probably only list a handful of them. Whereas I think the number, the type of the scale, the size, and also the sort of breadth of industry or sectors that these businesses span across in terms of delivering goods and services is incredible. And that growth, I don't know whether, and it'd be interesting to really know, the sort of startup history of those businesses, whether those businesses preceded, I think, as we know, in the last 10 years, there's been a significant shift in both government and corporations in their sort of procurement policies that really support or preferencing Indigenous business because of the very nature of those businesses and what they do. And so it's not about I think it's not just about giving the business owner an opportunity. It's more about the behaviour of those businesses that corporates and governments invest into, because of the fact that they're great incubators, they're great vehicles to create economic wealth. They're great employers of Indigenous people. So there's some of the sort of fundamental things of why Indigenous business are important in the ecosystem. And 10 years ago, the numbers that individuals knew of Indigenous business was probably just 5, or and there was a particular business, I think, that federal government referred to for 10 years. 10 years ago, as the only Indigenous business they knew, and it was a 50% owned business with Layton's at the time, and traditional owners in Western Australia, and similarly in Queensland, there was probably only one that was sort of considered by government as an Indigenous business that was operating in the market that they could supply to government. Whereas if you look at the situation now, just in Queensland alone, which I'm fairly intimate with, there's probably around about 6,000 Indigenous businesses. They employ, I think, probably about 15,000 people or something like that. So a fairly significant number with employment rate of around about the 60-70% in Indigenous employment, which is I think significant, and why they're so important in our ecosystem, because they're great incubators. They retain Indigenous people in employment. They train them. They develop them. They're likely to invest more. So they're the sort of things, I guess, that really are the big drivers behind why Indigenous business is so important to our ecosystem, to our industry.
Well, look, I'll just rattle off some figures. It's been amazing, what's happened over the last few years. I looked at the government website today, and there's over $3 billion worth of contracts that are going out to Indigenous businesses across Australia. And then you look at the mining industry, and you got probably nearly $3 or $4 billion there going into Indigenous business. You're looking at the state governments and the private sector. So you're seeing this amazing, incredible growth, which is it's been around for a while, but in the last 5 years, it's just exploded. And I work in the investment sector, and I do a lot of work in the corporate world, and I haven't ran across anyone who doesn't want to engage and work with Indigenous businesses. So there's this tremendous, incredible opportunities that can be done out there. So let's just move on a little bit and see where okay, we've got all this great opportunities in that. So where are the gaps? What needs to be done? Business creation in remote areas is still a bit of a struggle, and need to be. How do we take advantage of some of this mandatory set aside rules in the Indigenous procurement policy? But also, remote contracts under the IPP have been lagging, according to the last available data from the National Indigenous Australian Agency. So what do we need to do there and look at it? Darren.
I'll probably have a crack.
Okay, James, go on then.
Okay, I'll have a go. Look, I think there's a couple of things. One is, probably in the last 10 years, we've spent a significant amount of time. And yes, I mean, we've got this. I think we've got to get granular. That's probably the short of the long story. We've really got to understand that businesses alone, just because you're an Indigenous business, doesn't necessarily mean that you will behave exactly the way that the client expects to deliver value the way that the client, and why we leverage and why we preference Indigenous business in some instances, because, as I said before, it's because of their behaviour and the way they create value in communities. And where you've got significant economic disadvantage, Indigenous businesses are critical enablers that actually, one, they capture that revenue, and they're also able to distribute it and circulate it in the economy, and they have an ability to make an impact in local economies. And where you've got significant disadvantage, I think they're one of your fundamental building blocks. The interesting thing is that I suppose the bigger challenge for those businesses is whether they're able to sustain or deliver on those broader values in a sense of the type of behaviours that we want to incentivize as the right sort of behaviour. And some Indigenous businesses are not necessarily great employers of Indigenous people. That's just the reality. But on a whole, that's why they're so attractive, because they're incubators. They develop employment opportunities for Indigenous people. So I think that's one of the issues. The second is that the pre-qualification standards around procurement is often, particularly with agencies, is that what we've seen, particularly in government procurement, is that while the big numbers are being met, they're possibly, and we have to really interrogate the data on this. So I'm just going to say, maybe this is based on more anecdotal than anything else, is that there's a high likelihood, in my opinion, that a lot of those businesses are being won by existing suppliers, but it's not actually, it's not, those suppliers are probably being preferenced in different locations. Whereas one of the things that's really important about Indigenous business, a local Indigenous business operating in a particular region is likely to create and distribute value in that location. Whereas someone just moving around and winning contracts and whatever else is just operating like any other business. And they maintain a high employment, but they're not going to necessarily employ local people, because part of the challenge is obviously the skill and the lack of capability or supply in that local market. So I think that issue around targeting and growing Indigenous supply, that is Indigenous businesses in locations where we want impact, such as remote or regional communities where there's not very many successful Indigenous businesses. A lot of the aggregation of those businesses probably sitting in the more sort of richer pockets of the country, and where there's greater disadvantage, we're not as strategic as growing supply. And so I think there's this issue around supply, Indigenous supply, that we're probably not looking at data well enough to understand what that means, and then focus our investment into growing businesses in those target markets, because that's really that's the driver of your economic growth, if you like, for those local communities. If you can actually grow those local ecosystems with businesses, viable, Indigenous business are operating in them. I only know one community, for example, in Queensland that is championing that and has done well. In 5 years, they've been able to grow Indigenous businesses, but that's because the CEO and the mayor of that local, Aboriginal community made some very, very clear policy decisions about how they do that, and that's in Lockhart River.
Yeah.
Not many people do it like that. Not many people are strategic. So,
yeah,
Right.
Darren. That's interesting, because I gave some figures just a few minutes ago in regard to, like the federal government's direct funding of Indigenous affairs is about $4 billion. Indigenous businesses now pass that, and it's well on the way of doubling and moving forward in such a short time. We're only talking about 5 years. 5 years of this amazing growth in that. Now, and James has raised an important issue about, like with Lockhart River, they're the ones who are actually tough. Do we need to have some of our, community councils, community groups and that look at how they can have the Indigenous entrepreneurs and support them and how in their communities and how they can move forward? Yeah, Darren.
Definitely, I think. Oh, sorry, Darren.
No, go ahead.
I had a thought, because you started out asking about how can we boost Indigenous business in remote and regional areas, and for me, I think it's a really a great opportunity for us to not just create business, but to also maintain cultures, because that is one of the greatest assets, or the unique selling points that we have in Australia and for our own communities, is the fact that we have a culture that you can't find anywhere else, and it's the world's oldest living culture. So I think there's lots of opportunities in those regional areas for us to build businesses that bring a well-being back to the communities through the activities that they do, and in some ways bring back, I think, the traditional roles of people that they may have played in the past, and that's, I think, it's a reinvention of that in a contemporary sense. So I think, coming from a Torres Strait Islander background, the obvious one for me is fishing. There's an industry there which we're experts of and have been doing for a very, very long time, but even though it would seem to be quite simple, and I know that my grandfather operated pearling luggers way back in the early 1900s, but that sort of isn't present today that I can see, and there's other fishing or operators in the region. So I want to know what it is that's preventing those the communities to be able to pursue those things that they love doing, the things that make them feel better and bring well-being not just to themselves but to their families, and it perpetuates those traditional skills. So I mean, I'm also thinking of in the Kimberley region and throughout the Northern Australia, there's a Kakadu Plum Alliance. There's a whole bunch of opportunities, I think, in traditional medicines, in foods, in skincare products, and I'm thinking of Auntie Pat Torres, who runs Mai Harvest up in the Kimberley region, and she's providing a great business there for mob with the Kakadu plum. They're harvesting them. They're doing 3 tons a year, and on a good year they do 5 tons. And what it's doing is it's bringing those skills and the opportunity, I think, to unite generations of Indigenous people together around the traditional harvesting of those kinds of products. So it brings grandma, auntie, and then the grannies down as well. And the other thing it does that she told to me was that in the Christmas season, which is sort of around the time that they harvest or shortly after, it brings in income that is kind of strapped after that that Christmas season. So there's lots of opportunities, I think, in cultural tourism. It may not be. I'm not sure what the procurement opportunities are for those kinds of businesses, but there probably is some kind of procurement opportunities. I know that the Defence Department run all sorts of facilities around the country that have canteens, and they need a food supply, and we all know too that some of those unique products that we've used for centuries are really good for us in a health sense. They're really good for other Australians too. So they have very high nutritional or superfood value, particularly the Kakadu plum. I mean, I know that Kerry Colbung is also, providing skincare products out of Mundine, and it's a balm that her grandma and her mother sort of passed on to her, and she's going great guns as well, with just an online presence, and she's thinking about, and she wild harvests at the moment while she's thinking about how does she scale up to be able to meet a much bigger demand, especially for something that's an ancient remedy that has application. And it also brings well-being, not just to us, but for everybody. And I think there's a really big need for those kinds of things, let alone other cultural tourism opportunities, like the, Jabberkai Theatre is a very obvious one to me in terms of dance. There's bushwalks and getting to know plants and animals so I'm really looking forward to see how that space can work for our communities.
Yeah, look, you brought up a lot of good points there, because of course that cultural knowledge, that IP is so important in that. And before I go to you, Darren, because we've been discussing this on the export panel on that as well, I just got to do a plug for the Good Source. Thanks to the Good Source News for hosting our live stream tonight. If you want news you can trust, if you want media that isn't compromised by anti-everything narratives, you want the good source. Go to the good source news to hear from some of the best conservative thinkers in Australia and New Zealand, to hear independent voices on a free speech platform. Yeah. Now, Darren, we've talked about this. In fact, I'm glad you brought up Pat as well, Pat Therese, because I just only interviewed her last week on what she was doing in her business, and it's amazing some of the stuff that's going. And I also like the ranger programs, because you can develop them into good cultural tourism, eco-tourism type project for people who are doing their culture at the same time as having a commercial operation and that. So yeah, and we've spoken about this a fair bit, Darren. So what do you think?
I think at the very outset, yes, we've seen rapid growth. It's been off a low base, so that's only natural. But I actually think we're very much on the way to $100 billion Indigenous economy, and I borrowed that from Carol Ann Hilton in Canada, a First Nations woman, and she's also challenging both business and investment to imagine what's possible for $100 billion Indigenous economy in Canada. And I think we're not that far off setting in place some of the fundamentals, but we're at a critical juncture, I believe, where when we see the future of the Northern Australia and the development and the ongoing development of rare earths and large-scale renewable energy projects, we start to imagine bush ingredients or Indigenous botanicals. We start to imagine export markets and reaching into new market opportunities in international space. We're actually talking in the tens of billions of dollars. And I think part of maybe the challenge for policymakers, and then obviously the challenge for private investment in Australia, is to actually consider that a possibility. We are in the very, very near future. I believe we're going to see the first $1 billion transaction as an investment into an Indigenous controlled enterprise. I believe we're a little ways off, but we're in the race to see the first $100 million Indigenous company by market valuation. And I do believe that we're also going to see the opportunity for exports grow to $100 million worth of exports. So these are challenging numbers for many people that are more accustomed to a life of public policy deficit and then the politics of disadvantage. There are a lot of people that are going to be challenged to even imagine it's possible for Indigenous interests to actually be in control of multi-million dollar businesses and to guide and shepherd investments into the hundreds of millions of dollars. But I believe that is very much, within the next couple of years, we're going to see that eventuate.
Yeah. Look, look, I see businesses virtually on that $100 million level now. So we're going to really move into that area, which brings up the question, so because we're going to have an educated stream of people coming through on that. So is the university sector and the school system ready to really pump students through in regard to knowing that they can actually run their own businesses and install them in an early stage about that?
Well, I think this issue around formal education is good for some professions, but I wonder for Indigenous Australians if we wouldn't be better to promote the power of individual initiative and enterprise. There have been more than a few successful business people achieve great things and build wonderful companies and create much shareholder value without ever having gone through an MBA program or a university program. And I think there are a lot of family-run businesses which bring people through into the family business without those formal qualifications. I would rather put in place initiatives that support individual enterprise than to funnel people to a higher education path. And there is a lot more to be said for learning from your mistakes by being in business and by being around a business. So I would say we should caution any kind of fundamental push or direction into universities for that purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
And
so what is Nancia? Good.
Well, on that point, Darren, I think, what I see in successful business people is that entrepreneurial spirit, that I might say, that zealousness, and they're such dynamic people that, going to courses isn't usually what they want to do either. I mean, that sort of system just operates far too slow, I think, for the people who want to get things going. Yeah. And I think I'll put myself in that kind of category. The pace can be controlled by yourself when you start your own business, and you can explore, follow your own nose, and seek out what it is that you need to get that business going. And that's a really good learning experience in that, just by talking to people and following people that inspire you, and in the sector and all the associations and so on and so forth. When it comes to building a business. So, I mean, it's not difficult to identify a business, hopefully, that hasn't been made before in terms of the sector. We're not creating new sectors. It's just the new ideas for meeting markets that we need to think more carefully about.
And frankly,
I guess,
to commit some funding, I would rather suggest we'd send an entire cohorts of Indigenous kind of prospective entrepreneurs to a place like Israel. To learn from people that have demonstrated enterprise and business development. I'd much rather we learn by example, and you want to look at wonderful examples like you see in places like Israel, who have built economies and then built entrepreneurs and supported new industry at a very rapid pace. And I think there's a lot of merit in going and looking at the example of others that have succeeded.
I couldn't agree more. 100% right. James, sorry.
No, I was going to say that's 100% right. That's the view I share, and with all of the speakers this evening, because look, I think formal education is great, but the first and the best business lesson I learned, I ran a business when I was 15 for my uncle, and that taught me so much more. He taught me the fundamentals around cash flow, debt, customer service, entrepreneurship, all of those fundamentals. Never forgot them. I got the bug very young. He was inspiring, and he was one of the first entrepreneurs that I saw, in a community that was welfare driven. The whole economy was welfare. The funniest thing was that because I was a very good servant, and when I worked for him, he started pimping me out to the other business owners that were, small micro enterprises. So I learned a lot sort of doing that, and it was the best lesson in the world. But I think, coming to the point, what Darren spoke about, places like Israel, I think lessons in context in communities. I've always been a champion of this idea that, we should, when children, I think children are, particularly in remote communities, particularly in disadvantaged communities, if their lesson in life is around economics is welfare, then you have to locate businesses and other type of platform that exposes them to different type of dynamics and teaches them about risk. Because the fundamental issue, I think, that really welfare kills, and this is one of the most pernicious elements of, I believe, that welfare does to human capital, particularly our human capital that we care about, is that it actually it dents, it blunts their acuity, their commercial acuity, and that's that sort of entrepreneurship or that sharpness. And risk is a really big thing about business, is that really great operators in business understand risk. They intuitively understand what it is, because what they are really managing is an organization or an entity or a baby, effectively, that has to be nurtured, fed, and developed. And that means to be prioritized, to put it in the right, to always put it as being preeminent and important. Whereas I think when you look at the social, cultural issues that often people talk about, like, whether it's employment or in business, the humbug, issues, it's all about those values actually challenging, the prioritization of why businesses and principles around business are important. things like leakage is a classic problem where businesses have been typically managed in the past. We talk about leakage. Well, leakage is simply just people ripping value out of a business, whether that's through stock or basically poor cash control or whatever. Most businesses really worry about the revenue side, but when you listen to conversation, rarely people talk about cost, and cost is actually where the discipline is. The great practitioners are really about managing that risk, because they know that with you can make money if there's always going to be an opportunity to make money. It's how you control your cost that you create value. Sorry, mate.
That might bring us a segue over into the bad part, because
yes.
That leakage, is poor business practice, is what that is. And the other thing that's in there, I do believe too, is when we're looking at viable businesses, it is about fundamentals like cash flow, and then building revenues to the point where they contribute to your bottom line and your viability. And if we think about some of the frustrating parts around Indigenous enterprises, there's been a degree of putting people in cotton wool and sparing them the consequences of making poor business choices. And then we've also had a multitude of non-Indigenous players in there, masking as Indigenous enterprises, which are effectively controlled by non-Indigenous interests. And then they are also kind of spared the consequences of bad business practices. And so, there are a couple of bad parts, which is at some point, for it to be effective, people need to enjoy the consequences of their bad choices.
I like that word, enjoy the consequences of their bad choices, because, I've learned in business, and that, over quite a few years now, is that I've learned more from a mistake. I've learned more from watching other people make mistakes, and I've learned so much from different people, and then you look at why you made that mistake, and you come out better. In fact, look, the best business people in the world, they have all made mistakes. There's not one of them who hasn't made a mistake, and some of them have been pretty costly. I always use the line about OneTel, where Lachlan Murdoch and James Packer, lost $1 billion. So these things do happen, but you've got to. The main thing good thing about being an entrepreneur and running a business is how you get up off the ground. You've just been knocked down. It's a third round in the boxing fight, and you've just been knocked down. You're sitting there going, gee, this is tough. So what have you learned? How you get up and then continue. And that's the secret to business, really.
Warren, the other part that's in there too is that linkage between risk and reward. And if you don't understand and appreciate that you're not entitled to a big reward without taking some risk. And taking some risk is not the same as being risk avoidant. It's about managing the risk and about saying, okay, then how much are we going to put at stake on this bet? And then how are we going to mitigate those risks? And obviously the people that can execute better by managing the risk to realize the reward are those Indigenous executives which are going to be in tight supply and high demand, because you want to be able to redeploy those Indigenous executives with that experience and have had the bumps and the bruises to be able to move into those ventures. Because when you start dealing with bigger and bigger challenges, the challenge on execution absolutely escalates. But that's where you need to mitigate that risk with having good experienced Indigenous executives.
That's true, and I learned a lot from, because I went to a Catholic school, so there's a lot of migrants in my school, and this is the group of people who come just off the boat, and they could hardly speak English, but they had that entrepreneur spirit about it, and they wanted to start a new life and doing amazing things, and that's what they did, and the second gen, when you get to their children, the second generation, these are the people who built and saw how their parents worked and how hard it was for them, and they're the ones who built amazing businesses in Australia. And you look at it at the stock exchange in Sydney, and you'll just see the titles. You just see the people who have done that. And this is the most important part for us: is how do we get that how do we get that into our communities, and that you and support them? I'll give you an example of bad issue. There's this when I was in Dubbo, this company there is making about $100,000 a year washing the wheelie bins, right? He's going around charging people $5, $10 to wash the wheelie bin. Anyway, the local CDP brought it, and they got this young Aboriginal guy. He was running around doing it. In fact, he grew the business. He actually started growing the business, and then he thought to himself, oh, I'm just working for CDP. Why don't I put to him that I can buy the business? And so he talked to the local bank, I think it was Westpac, and they said, yeah, we can loan you the money to buy that business. So he went to them and said, I want to do this. And they said, oh, no, you can't do that. This is a community development CDP program, and we're not selling it to someone to run off and run a business. And so, of course, what he did, he left, and he went off with him and his wife. They was only a young couple, 22, 21, and they built a business somewhere else. That business, after he's left, collapsed within 3 months. And so, my advice to him would have been, you should have gave it to him for free, and he would have built a business, and he would have built a future for his family. Yeah. So how do we get around some of that stuff?
Yeah, it's an interesting thought, I think, too. You talked in terms of the bad. I think I don't know if it's bad, but it's fairly evident to me that a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander businesses aren't necessarily don't necessarily have a vision to be scaled up. But there's what I do know is that there's a lot of Indigenous businesses that are there, what I like to call subsistence. So they're basically replacing their work, what they previously had, to be their own bosses, which is a really good thing to do, I think, for health and well-being, and to be your own boss and to control things around you, rather than scaling up. And when I'm thinking about scaling up and meeting a bigger demand, it reminds me of Nicole Stewart and her father in Melbourne and their business, and I think his name was John. Forgive me if that's wrong. And Nicole Stewart now runs a very large operation used to be called Complete Workwear, and at Tullamarine Airport. And they actually have for many, many years, since I think about the 80s. He's actually started in the 70s out of the back of the boot of his car, washing laundry for the airline industry. And now they're massive. And, I can't tell you what the exact figures are, but, there's a handed down business that started from something that was, needed because he didn't have any other income. And, it's very much rags to kind of riches story, I think, in that sense. And, they're the sort of stories that I think we need to have more of. Like, how do we get those tiny little operations that maybe start out of the boot of your car or in the garage of your house, and how do we get them up to, scale, to build the skills? And then, we also know that Indigenous businesses employ more Indigenous people than any other businesses do, and they actually create more value in terms of the professional development pathways of the people within them. Just ask Nicole. She used to work on the floor in the laundry factory, and now she's the CEO. So I want to, if there's another business, I think of Print Junction that's doing a similar sort of thing here in Adelaide. Yeah. So that's one of the bads, I think. How do we make that leap?
Yeah, which is what you're pushing for, Darren, in regard to looking at how people can export and grow and scale up and grow their businesses.
Yeah, there's if we look at where mainstream businesses and enterprises are, and there's a spectrum and there's a universe of possibilities. And so one of the challenges that we're trying to address is we're trying to kind of build those, that architecture. We're trying to physically find place where we can incentivize and support small businesses, Indigenous businesses, become medium-sized enterprises, and then turn to have medium-sized enterprises become large corporations. We also need to see a bit more of those Indigenous enterprises moving into publicly listed on stock exchanges. So the export opportunities, if you think we do live on an island, and there's a big economy outside of these shores, and frankly, there are a number of Indigenous opportunities which will have appeal into those export markets. And then in addition to that, there is a lot of direct foreign investment into Australia, and a lot of that investment may find a home, a suitable commercial home, with Indigenous enterprises, whether they be large-scale agribusinesses, whether they be as proponents of development of natural resources on country, or what I think is going to be a very, very exciting possibility is the use of Indigenous botanicals in both products for export, so manufactured goods, also the use of Indigenous botanicals and possibly their use in therapeutic goods. We think about something that's truly Indigenous, that belongs to this place and that is unique and is a selling point. We start thinking about Indigenous cultures that are from here, but you can also imagine the Indigenous botanicals and the wealth of possibilities that exist in those botanicals. And, frankly, we should see something established very shortly, I believe, at a formal level, which would ensure that Australia and Australian companies benefit from the commercialisation of that Indigenous knowledges and those Indigenous botanicals.
Yeah, exciting stuff. Yeah, look, you raised it earlier, Nancia, in regard to those botanicals. The scale up that could happen in regard to Indigenous foods, Indigenous cosmetics, and stuff like that. Do you see a really good growth area, a really great opportunity for that to happen?
Yes, I do. I think I said at the start, that there's actually more businesses out there than you really can imagine. And I think there's a lot of people in that space already. But they are those small scale businesses that, people are operating out of their own homes perhaps. And so I think that the one thing that might help for those, particularly in the sort of botanicals sector, and the use of native ingredients is the fact that, we somehow need to wrest control of that asset that we have. And the asset that we have is that Indigenous intellectual property knowledge. And so we need to make sure that we wrest that back and keep it for ourselves, because it is ours and it has been for a long time through, lots of years of history. And I think that needs to be recognised in the current space because, one of the keys is, I talked about Kakadu plum before. There's heaps of non-Indigenous businesses running that Kakadu plum farms up in the Byron Bay sort of, northern coast area of New South Wales. And they're bigger scale operations than our own. So, yeah, there are lots of opportunities, I think, to be able to give our mobs and their local communities, I think, due credit and value for that knowledge through the IP recognition of that. And I know that there's a food database that they're putting together through the MasterChef chef, Jock Zonfrillo. So I'd like to see how that, translate, I suppose, into better opportunities for our mobs to be able to turn that into enterprise that benefits our communities. And at the same time, as I said before, it maintains culture and keeps people on country often as well. Or if they're not on country all the time, they get to go out there and through the operations of those businesses, and that's really good for your soul and the spirits.
Well, there's a very good commercial made here for investments, very similar to the way the French and the Italians have asserted their rights over geographic indicators. So, for example, wine that's produced from the region of Champagne in France is the only wine that can be called champagne. And they had to assert those rights, which had commercial implications and benefit, obviously, for the Champagne region of France. And there are direct parallels where Australian national interests are actually going to be well served by us exercising that same assertion over Indigenous botanicals, because, frankly, we're not that far away from seeing another superfood move into a global market, whether it's quinoa or kale or blue corn or whatever. But there's every potential for that to happen out of Australia. And so unless Australia asserts its national interest in those Indigenous botanicals and then puts provisions in place for us to commercialise that in a way that's done with Indigenous interest, then we'd be shooting ourselves in the foot. And so there's a great opportunity for some of that early work to go in And frankly, if it's not from here, then you can't claim it as a product that's using a key Indigenous botanical as a key active ingredient.
And it should be recognised as such. And I think there's benefits not just for us, but for the whole of the Australian economy if that can happen. And I'm thinking about, the macadamia nut, which is one of my favourite nuts, and it's ours, but everybody thinks it's from Hawaii. There's a really good example of something we need to wrest back, and that really could benefit Australia as the country of origin of that food.
Yeah. Darren and I and a number of other people have spoken about this a lot. In fact, I had a webinar only on Thursday. Yeah, Thursday with Ken Wyatt, the Minister for Indigenous Affairs, and it was about planting that seed in his head about this geographic, this ownership, this intellectual, traditional ownership of that. And the French and the Italians have been good leaders in this area. So James, what do you think about, should we be pushing the government to do that type of legislation for us?
Absolutely. Look, I think we should be. I think it's a policy issue, and because it's almost like the extension of the sort of native title rights or whatever to botanicals and to flora effectively, as having some sort of that sort of Indigenous sort of rights, sort of focus. And the reason why is because that security of rights is important, because there's so many unlocked opportunity in the Indigenous sort of estate, the broader sort of, marketplace for Indigenous people. But where they're going to be beaten is that somebody is much better resourced with better muscle, they can leverage all of that if we don't protect some of that or give some preference to Indigenous people around some policy. Because I think I'll give you a classic example. There's a whole heap of stuff that I know because I was raised by my grandparents in the Torres Strait around natural whatever you call it, botanicals or pharmaceutical. There's some amazing products, and I will never tell anyone unless I can actually secure it, because the reality is that the minute you tell someone can go off and leverage that, and before you know it, they've got a product on the market using the exact thing that Aboriginal and Torres Strait people have been using for centuries, for thousands of years. So I just won't. And in fact, I was talking to my older brother about this the other night, and we were sharing some of our knowledge. And I said, don't tell anyone. But quite frankly, it shouldn't be like that. It shouldn't be like that at all. It should be that right, which is really a common right or knowledge that has been shared by Aboriginal and Torres Strait people, should be held and secure so that they can leverage it and unlock it and create business out of it. And if the industry and other people want to come into it, Indigenous people still have some ability to benefit, whether it's 10% or 20% or whatever, but they have some sort of buy-in. Whereas I think often, and I suspect that industry has already been has been smart about this. They're already documenting, and they already know some of the the sort of the natural botanicals and the pharmaceutical qualities, and they've already, and we know this from research, because that's one of the issues around ethical research, is that people go into community and they build their PhD, learning, appropriating community knowledge, bringing it back and giving it to university. The interesting thing is when you talk about this issue around copyright, and I'm not sure where this particular business is at the moment, but Mayuma, for example, which is it was a civil contracting company, but now it's expanded to a whole bunch of other things. I remember that in more recent times, they're now looking at, because they've gone into a sort of research, joint venture with the University of Queensland around using Spinifex. I think I can't remember the sort of technology they use, but I suspect that it's using nanotechnology to extract the cells out of the Spinifex grass, that when you put it into rubber, it actually makes it 10 times, I think, or 100 times stronger than the strongest rubber that you have available in the market today. Now, I remember, I know Colin Saltmere personally, and I know that that's something that he had to prosecute for his own community. But he was in a real strong position because he'd been successful in business and worked, through that process and had very good support. But he also had good leadership to be able to do that. Not many Indigenous people can actually protect their rights like that. So I think that's where it's really, this is where it's really vulnerable. It's a big challenge. I don't think we invest in development and unlocking opportunities, but the first thing about developing opportunities with Indigenous people, in terms of those opportunities that are locked inside community because of their knowledge or some other means, but they don't have the capability, the finance, and everything else to do it. It's the fact that we don't prioritize that development because nobody wants to pick up the cost.
Well, can I suggest we have a couple of precedents. So, for example, when the Australian economy was in its fledgling years, there was a public investment into wheat. A public investment in wool. We saw the creation of the Australian Wheat Board. We saw the creation of the Australian Wool Mark. We've seen where the public sector has stepped in and rightfully supported fledgling industries. And there's a real advantage in that. And we have multiple examples of where it's been very, very constructive and a very positive thing. And I think it's due for us to consider something very similar for Indigenous botanicals. And that's a significant commitment to research and development, looking at things of production, because we got to get out of wild harvest for some of these, and we got to start looking at mass production. We've got to look at manufacturing and processing. We're obviously looking for some of those downstream activities where we can capture some of that value by seeing that happening in manufacturing, and Nancia has indicated, in regional and remote Australia. You start looking at supporting regional economies in this way. And to do that would require a commitment and to say, listen, this is something we're going to do. Downstream, the benefits are going to be well established, and they will have to be with Australian companies. And then Indigenous peoples, there's no reason why Indigenous people shouldn't be looking to attract investment capital to take a place in that value chain. So, very good points.
Yeah, they're great points. And obviously that secret you have, James, is a beauty product because you're looking very handsome. Which sort of leaves you as the ugly, Darren. But anyway, that raises a few questions. But like when you're talking about the IP and the protection of that IP, and we've just seen the battle that's just arisen out of the Aboriginal flag in regard to the IP rights of that. So we've got to be very, I agree. We've got to, do very move down this path of protecting our IP and protecting those rights, and that will have a big flow onto the rest of Australia as well, because we'll have some really incredible industries that are coming out here. We'll hire, yes, we're hiring Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but we'll be hiring everyone else. But also people can subcontract off and do transports and other things and that. But we've got to be. But there is that sort of question, which could be that sort of how do we ensure that we don't end up getting it this property right fight and how we work through it? That's a big question. Yeah.
There is something to be said for leaving lawyers out of this and coming up with commercial responses or commercially led responses. A lot of people will be thinking about trademarks and patents and kind of moving down to protecting IP down that path, and they're reasonable conversations to have. But I've usually found that whenever you invite a lawyer in, whatever the outcome is, usually involves keeping the lawyer around again. And I'm not so sure they're so commercially minded necessarily.
Except my wife. She's listening.
One of the things I actually want is I really want to see that emphasis on the commerciality. Frankly, if we can create businesses that protect their IP or commercialize that IP, if we can create viable businesses then the interests, obviously, are well established. There is some opportunity for investment as well to have a real part in this, because obviously if you've made an investment, you got a vested interest to see in a return on that investment. And I think that's one of those very powerful factors in the free market, is that once the market makes some choices, it's going to be looking to protect their investment. And I think that is something that we should be offering as Indigenous interests. We should be saying there is a market opportunity here, and can we attract investment on those favourable terms to make a financial return, to seize and commercialise a market opportunity.
Yeah.
There's also, sorry.
So no, go on, Nancia. That's good.
So there's also, in the time of COVID, I suppose, and, the Black Lives Matter movement and climate change in particular too, there's also, I think, hopefully I see a growing desire for the Australians and other people around the world to not just invest in something for profit, but to invest in something for the future of our planet, our people as well. And there's lots of, I think, positives. I think because of that, I would say there's a bit of a shift that has become evident. And I hear people, I seem to hear this chatter that's sort of getting a bit louder about how do we make sure that if we're going to run a business, it's not just for profit, it's not just for now, it's also for the future. And then the people and businesses that are looking at carbon neutral impacts, and I'm thinking of fire management up in the Arnhem Land area where the rangers look after, they burn earlier in the season and smaller rather than later in the season, and prevent those larger bushfires. And that really does help to make a positive impact on the planet. So I think that as Indigenous people, we also want to look after the country. And I remember, to bring up Auntie Pat again, she said that when she picks the kakadu plum, they make sure they don't damage the plant, so that then they don't damage the land around, so that, it's able to refruit up to, more, I think it was 3 times more than normal plantations in terms of that output. So, there's if we're going to have businesses, I want to make sure that we're offering something to customers, and I'm from a marketing background, of course, that they want. They want to feel good. They want to make sure the planet's good. They want to make sure there's something in the future for their children. And, they want to make sure that everything that we've got now is there in the future for generations to come. So I think that's one of the selling points that we can try and think about. And I think that Indigenous business and people have that sensibility towards protecting the planet, and our people do it as well.
Yeah, we're getting close to time. It would have, very quickly, one of the uglies, of course, is how some people have manipulated the process by, with the black cladding stuff. And so, how do we, how can we really, defeat that beast? Because I think there has to be some stronger rules coming in. And James,
That's a very interesting question, Warren, because I probably take quite an interesting sort of position on it, and I'll talk very quickly on it. And that is, yes, it's true that in that situation where you've got some Indigenous owners that are supposedly just owners on paper, but they are very passive in the actual operation and management of the business. But I think it also masks some of the deeper issues. I think that policy actually creates some real challenges, and I think we probably had this discussion a few days ago, and I mentioned that one of the big challenges is that if you had an opportunity to, let's say someone came along and said to you, hey, let's do something, and and I really want to make a difference, work with Indigenous people, but I want to give you some equity in a company, but I can't give you 50% equity because the company is a fairly sizable, very valuable business, and so I can only give you 20%. But we're also going to be committed to working with Indigenous people. I want to maximize employment to move it up to 50%, have some really ambitious targets. Plus, I really want to grow you as an owner. That to me is not black cladding. Black cladding, but it isn't an Indigenous business either, based on current definition, because current definition is either 51% if it's based on a certified business with Supply Nation, or a majority-owned Indigenous business, or a 50-50 is basically, according to the Commonwealth and also some states and territories, also an Indigenous business. So I think this policy issue masks some of the broader concerns I have in the marketplace around cladding. Is that cladding to me is where someone is just, someone on the surface of things is just, appears to be the owner, but is not active and doesn't understand the risk. But if you were to take the risk of having equity in a business that's worth 20%, and it's a $20 million business, you also take the risk of failing. So you might be up for the cost. So it's not just a benefit.
This sounds like a longer discussion than that. Look, some really good stuff tonight. You've raised a lot of really good, interesting things. Great conversation. Thanks, Nancia, for coming along. We've got to get you back. We've got to get the good back. And well, I'm sort of stuck with the ugly in regard to James and Darren. So thanks for being on the show. Our next webinar is going to be in 2 weeks' time, and we're going to be looking at the what's coming out of the coroner's report in regard to children in the Northern Territory, and there's some really damning stuff that we need to confront and deal with, because the government up there has really failed and let down our kids. Okay, so I'll see you in 2 weeks' time, and we'll have a discussion. It'll be me and Jacinta Price, and we'll have a sort of armchair conversation. So good night, and thank you for everything.